Let's go back to Luke chapter 22, and we'll finish Luke 22 and get into 23 today. But we'll start in Luke 22, verse 54. And it says in Luke 22:54, it says, "Then took they him and led him and brought him into the high priest's house, and Peter followed afar off. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were sat down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him, and said, 'This man was also with him.' And he denied him, saying, 'Woman, I know him not.' And after a little while, another saw him and said, 'Thou art also of them.' And Peter said, 'Man, I am not.' And about the space of 1 hour after, another confidently affirmed, saying, 'Of a truth, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean.' And Peter said, 'Man, I know not what thou sayest.' And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, 'Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice.'" So, of course, what we're looking at here is the arrest of Jesus, the taking of Jesus right after he instituted his Lord's Supper, and he spoke with his disciples and gave them some final instruction and gave a discourse in the upper room. So now he goes out onto the Mount of Olives. We know he prayed there. His disciples were there with him. They prayed. They fell asleep. He was in agony. He sweat, as it were, great drops of blood. An angel came and strengthened him. But he prayed, prayed, and then went a little further, and Judas and a multitude came. Judas betrayed him and turned him over while, in the nighttime, while there weren't big crowds around, other than the crowd that they brought with them of the Jewish leaders and Roman soldiers. And so they took him into, first, the house of Annas. Annas is the father-in-law of the high priest at the time, Caiaphas. Annas had been the high priest before, and while Caiaphas is the high priest, Annas is really kind of the one with the power behind the scenes. And so they first went to his house in the nighttime. And let me go back a little bit. Let's see. So Luke really doesn't focus on that first meeting at Annas' house. He kind of goes straight to the one at Caiaphas' house. But they did start off, they took him first to Annas' house and then to the high priest Caiaphas. Peter followed afar off. Do you know where James and John and Bartholomew were? Scattered. They were gone. All the others, John was actually in the house, because the high priest knew John somehow. High priest knew John's family, so he was in the house. The others, James, we don't read about James, Bartholomew. The others scattered. They were gone. And so, but Peter followed afar off. And, just hours before, Peter had said, "I will follow you till death. I will never deny you, even if it costs my life." I will follow you. And Jesus said, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows. And so he goes in, he follows afar off. So that makes it hard when they begin to question him, to say he's one of the Lord's disciples. Not only that, he's seen the way that they came at him. It wasn't a couple of people coming to arrest him. It's maybe 600. It was a big multitude that came, and I think Peter was caught off guard, and scared. And so he follows afar off, and when they made this fire, some of the servants sat around it, so Peter tried to blend in with them. He tried to blend in, but in verse 56, we see that a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire and earnestly looked upon him. And I can just imagine, have you ever felt someone staring at you? Anyone seen Back to the Future, the first time Marty sees George McFly as a teenager, and he just stares at him, and George is looking, and he finally says, what? You can feel it sometimes, it seems, when people are staring at you, and this maid is earnestly looking at Peter, and I just imagine, I can almost feel the tension of that. She's earnestly looking, and finally she says something. She says, this man was also with him. And I don't know how she, whether she had seen them the days leading up to this. I don't suppose she was out there at the garden during the arrest, but somehow she knew that Peter was one of them. She says, this man was also with him, and he denied him, saying, woman, I know him not. And then after a little while, another saw him and said, thou art also of them. And Peter said, man, I am not. It goes a little further. It says an hour later. So this, a lot was going on that is not detailed here. A full hour goes by of them questioning and asking Jesus and trying to find how they can condemn him. A full hour goes by and Peter's sitting there. And so he may have started to feel like he's in the clear. But an hour goes by, and another says, of a truth, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter said, man, I know not what thou sayest. Another verse says that he cursed. One place says, your speech betrayeth you. And so his speech, he spoke as a Galilean. He probably spoke as a Christian. But he begins to swear and to hide his identity, to try to change his identity. And he says, I don't know what you're talking about. And so Peter denied Jesus in 3 specific ways. First, he denied knowing him. He said, I don't know him. So he's not just denying their relationship, their friendship, his discipleship. He's denying even knowledge. I don't know that guy. And then he denies being a follower of Jesus. You are of them. You are one of them. It didn't say you're a friend of his. They're talking about you are one of that group. And so now he denies being a follower. And then he denies even being from Galilee. And so he is, he's very concerned, no doubt, with what would become of him if they tie him to Jesus. But this is what Jesus said would happen. And immediately, while he was yet speaking, so he's in the process of changing his speech, maybe cussing, maybe cursing, swearing, I'm not a Galilean. While speaking, the rooster crows. He didn't even have time to finish what he was saying. The rooster crows. And then it says in verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. Now, you can imagine there's a lot going on right there where the Lord is. Peter followed afar off, and he's out in the court with the fire while Jesus is inside. And Jesus is being questioned. He's being tried. But at this moment, he turns his eyes, looks through the crowd right at Peter. And even the word looked that is used here in the Greek, it really doesn't carry with it the feeling of a condemning look. It is more of a looking with longing or love. And, but that, maybe even makes it worse for Peter. Peter is saying these things, and he catches Jesus' eyes looking right at him, and he just went out and wept bitterly. It hadn't been that long before that Jesus stated this would happen, and here it is. And Peter said, no, I'll go and die with you, but here he is doing exactly as the Lord said he would. And so he went out. It says in verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. And the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him. So there's still, keep in mind, this is nighttime. It's in a house. And they are trying him in some mock trial, fake illegal trial. They weren't allowed to have trials in the middle of the night. The trial was to start at daylight and end with daylight. And furthermore, in one of those trials, on the day of the trial, if the accused was acquitted, that would be recorded, and that would be fine. But if he was found guilty, they couldn't find him guilty on that first day of trial. The night had to pass before they could pass judgment. And none of that happened here. This is a trial at night. It's illegal. And then they begin mocking and beating him in this house. And here's how. Verse 64. And when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, prophesy, who is it that smote thee? And the thing is, he could have given their full biography, who smote him. He could have listed all their sins they had committed that day, or 40 years ago, or 10 years ago, or whatever. Jesus knows intimately who was striking him. But he didn't say anything. And, in that way, Jesus is victorious over the emotions of the flesh that no doubt he carried, right? As a man, he had all the emotions of man. And he had also all the power to do whatever he wanted to those who were striking him. So can you imagine the restraint it took for him not to call out who did it, not to accuse them and make their sins public, and not to rain fire down on them? He restrained in all those ways, and so he is victorious over the the flesh in a way that, none of us are. He was completely sinless. He knew his what he came to do, and this was his moment. This was the time. And he could not get out of this. And so he sat quietly and let them do these things. Now, keep in mind, this is a trial, and they are judging Jesus. And we've seen how they treated him. And now consider that all of these men, Caiaphas, Annas, all the ones who smote him, will one day be judged by him. And, I'm not saying they all were lost when they died. I pray that many, after the crucifixion, accepted him. And we know some did. It seems the Roman guard recognized and said, truly, this was the Son of God. I believe there are others who, though they hated and crucified him, later accepted him as Lord. But can you imagine for those like Caiaphas, who I assume never did accept the Lord, and the tables are turned, and now he sits in judgment by the one he judged. And remember that Jesus truly was not guilty. Keep that in mind. He was not guilty. They found men and brought them in to give false witness against him. So Caiaphas, being, a high priest, is guilty of many things here, and he will, the judgment is yet to come, and he will be judged for those things. So they blindfolded him, they mocked him, they struck him on the face and said, "Prophesy, who is it that smote thee?" And many other things blasphemously, spake they against him. And as soon as it was day, okay, so it's still night, right? It's still dark. And the rooster crows just before morning. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into their council. It was not legal what they had done. And so now they're going to bring the Sanhedrin together and try to legitimize this. And they led him into their council, saying, "Art thou the Christ? Tell us." And he said unto them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I also ask you, you will not answer me, nor let me go. Hereafter shall the Son of Man sit on the right hand of the power of God." Then said they all, "Art thou the Son of God?" And he said unto them, "Ye say that I am." And they said, "What need we of any further witness? For we ourselves have heard of his own mouth." Well, the problem is, they say, well, he's now just confessed and he's guilty. The problem is what he said was true. He is the Son of God. And so there is still no crime. But they read it as blasphemy, claiming to be God when you are not. And that's how they see Jesus. So that's it for them. They say, we don't need any more trial. We don't need any more witness. This is it. Condemned. And so now they'll try to, of course, the Jews were not really allowed to sentence someone to death. They were occupied by Rome, and so they needed to get permission from the Roman government to put someone to death. Although we know they tried several times to kill Jesus without even trial. So they just got to be kind of careful to try to look like they're playing along with Roman law. They use their rebellion in ways to sway the Roman power. There were things that they did to try to coerce Pilate and the Romans into doing what they wanted. All right, any questions on chapter 22? Yes.
Did the Roman soldiers stay around all night long, do you suppose?
I don't know.
And you mentioned the Romans and the Jews came together, people that did not like each other, but in order to go against Jesus, they came together, they joined forces.
I will say, Pilate apparently had the authority to appoint a high priest. And his whole time, Pilate ruled from AD 26 to AD 36. And that whole time, I guess, or much of that time, he had chosen Caiaphas as high priest. And so there's another thing that happened. Pilate, he used the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. He took money out of the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. And there was an uprising among the Jews about this. And he brutally, he came in with horses. And I think that's where, they had built an aqueduct. And so they were so mad, they surrounded his house for 5 days. Jews did. And then he had them go into this other area. And then he brought in a bunch of guards and just beat them, some to death, and trampled them with horses. And however, it's said that he could not have done that without the agreement of Caiaphas. So they didn't get along, but they had a bit of a political relationship there. The leaders of the Jews with Pilate, probably. And like I said, when they didn't like what he was doing, they would threaten uprising. You know how politicians are today. They're kind of friendly, and they look like they're fighting on camera, but then a lot of times they're working together behind the scenes, and when they need to, they'll get the people in an uproar. That's how it was back here as well, it seems. So, but nonetheless, when it came to Jesus, a lot of people that did not typically work together, for instance, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that had bitter disagreements between them, they would work together if it was against Jesus. Any other questions on Luke 22? Yes?
I had a comment regarding the thinking back with Peter when he denied Christ. He was recognized. Today, people recognize us, maybe by what we say and claim or whatever about being a Christian, or maybe we quote scripture in front of people, whatever it might be. That people will recognize us, but sometimes when they actually want to maybe throw us into a discussion of having to actually defend the faith, we might back off.
Yeah.
Kind of like, Peter actually denied, and I would hope and pray that I wouldn't do that, but we're all subject to that.
Yes.
When we're put on a spot as not standing up as strong as we think that we are. I mean, Peter had just got through saying, like you said, I'll go to the death, and he took the sword to the soldier. But when it come down to it, are we really going to stand for Christ? And it makes me think of the young girl at Columbine, who actually was given the opportunity to deny knowing Jesus and save her life, and she refused to do that, and her life was taken.
Amen.
I'd like to think I do the same, but none of us know until we're put in that position.
Right. Amen. Any others? Okay, chapter 23, Luke 23. So again, they had said, "What need we any further witness? We have heard this of his own mouth." And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. The whole Sanhedrin gets up and goes and leads him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. What'd they do there? This is the Sanhedrin. They're the court, the Jewish court that is supposed to determine truth and hear cases. And the first thing they say to Pilate is this man was perverting the nation and refusing, what was it? Not only refused, he was forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. Absolutely contrary to action and word by Jesus. He said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar. He never said, forbid tribute to Caesar.
Do you remember, who was it that if the coin?
I think they were Jews that came and said, they were trying to trap him, probably Pharisees, trying to trap him and say, oh, look whose inscription. Well, no, that's not what they said. They said, Caesar says we ought to give tribute, should we? What they were trying to do is get those who hated the Romans, they were trying to get them mad at Jesus if he said, pay your taxes. And if he said you don't pay your taxes, then he was going to get the Romans, But Jesus just said, whose inscription is on it? Give unto Caesar that which is Caesar. Give unto God that which is God's. Whose inscription is on you? God. We are made in his image. So he said that to Pharisees as they tried to trap him. So the Sanhedrin, it'd be like, if the whole courthouse in Indio, there was someone they deemed guilty, and the whole courthouse in Indio, leaves and takes someone to, I don't know, to Sacramento or wherever. But they lied. They had at least what was laws broken in their custom, which is claiming to be God. And again, he didn't break that law, but they could have said that, right? They could have just said, this man is breaking our law in claiming to be God. But they wanted to rile up the Romans. They wanted something that Pilate would grab onto. Pilate was already in some trouble. He was already, Caesar Tiberius, or Tiberius Caesar, had problems with this Judea, this area in Judea, and Pilate was not doing a great job at keeping order. And so they wanted to, say, oh, this man's not, he's forbidding to pay tribute to Caesar. And then saying that he himself is Christ a king. So they brought 3 accusations. Only one thing was true that he had said. And Pilate asked him, saying, art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. Remember when we were going back and talking about that this is the time of Passover and all the lambs come into Jerusalem on the 10th of Nisan. And they are examined until the 14th. And if no flaw is found in them, then they can be the Passover lamb. Here, Jesus is being examined by Pilate, and he states that I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, he stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. The crowd became more fierce. And sometimes it doesn't matter what the truth is. In a mob, they can just go after and they become more fierce and more riled up. And, so Pilate, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. He said, are you a Galilean? And when he found the truth that he was a Galilean, he wiped his brow and he said, great, let's send him to who has authority and jurisdiction over the Galileans. Send him to Herod. And Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at this time. But Herod was king over the area that included Galilee. And so Pilate figured he got a break here. So verse 6, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at the time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he had hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Herod is giddy about Jesus being here, and he's excited. He wanted to see him. He's been waiting to see a miracle done. And then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And here Jesus fulfills prophecy that he stood as a lamb, dumb before his shearers, silent. But the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. There was no rest among these Jewish leaders. When they're standing before Pilate, they're just crying out and becoming more fierce and accusing. And here now that he's with Herod, they're vehemently accusing him. They will not let it go. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. So Herod's done with it. He can't find any reason. And I wanted to mention when we hear about Pilate saying that I find no fault in him, you got to know who Pilate was. Like I already said, Pilate, when there was a bit of an uprising, he brought in his men and beat people to death. He was a violent, ruthless man. Very violent, very, seems like short-fused. And, let's go look at Luke 13. We'll go back a few chapters, Luke 13, where it tells a little more about Pilate. In another instance where they were trying to rage bait Jesus, trying to get Jesus to come out and say something that would give them reason to accuse him, it says, there were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. So there were some Jews who were doing sacrifices, and Pilate had them killed and then mixed the blood of those people with their sacrifices. And so Pilate, don't think that he's a fair-minded, reasonable man. He's a wicked, violent man who is only too happy to kill people for no reason. So that makes it all the more interesting that when he tries Jesus and he's under all this pressure, he continues to say, I find no fault in him. He's not beyond killing innocent people. But here he says, I find no fault in him. And so, anyway, so Pilate had seen him, Herod had seen him, and mocked him. And, Luke is he's not real detailed about some of the suffering Jesus endured here with Herod. Yeah, they mocked him, but they beat him and put a robe on him as well. And so they sent him back to Pilate. So verse 12, this is Luke 23:12. And the same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. And this is recorded in history that Pilate and Herod had a big problem with each other, but on this day, they became friends. That's a matter of historical fact as well. So, verse 13, and Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, said unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accuse him. They are vehement, but Pilate continues to say, I've tried him, I've questioned him, I don't see any guilt here. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. Well, what's that about? Like I said, Pilate was not above punishing an innocent man. He believes Jesus is innocent. He believes there is nothing guilty. He's found no evidence of guilt in him. But to appease the crowd, he says, I will chastise him. Now, that chastise doesn't begin to describe what he had done to Jesus. And the beating that Jesus endured everywhere on his body, the blood loss from it, the skin torn, and the being able to see his bones just plainly. It says he was not recognizable as a man. His face was marred more than any other. It would have been absolutely horrific. And to think this was done to a man that Pilate believed was innocent. And, by the way, who was innocent. Yes. She said, she warned him, she called him and said, come in here. Don't have anything to do with this man. Do not do it. Don't yield to the mob with this one. She said, I've had a dream about this man. And, yeah, she was, and, you know, I read some things, and it says, oh, history's not sure he was even married. Sure, he was married. He was married, and his wife gave this warning. But the things Jesus went through already, and Pilate is doing this expecting that that'll be it, that'll appease the crowd, and it'll be over. With the beating he took, I just don't know how long a man could survive that anyway, even if he wasn't crucified. I mean, it just, you know, the law among the Jews was no more than 39 stripes because 40 was thought to kill a man. And they did that and then turned him over. And it just, it is a horrific thing. It's hard to imagine, you know, being in a crowd and watching and calling for that. But that's what happened. So he figures that will appease them. So I will, back to verse 16. Pilate says, I will therefore chastise him and release him. For of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast. Well, that was the tradition of the time and the law, that at the feast of Passover they would release one prisoner. You know, and there was supposed to be an emphasis on mercy. You know, Israel is God's chosen people, and God is a God of mercy. And so mercy was kind of baked into supposed to be baked into their legal system. Even the idea that a judgment could not be passed during the day of the trial, but would have to give a day, that was an appeal to mercy. I thought that maybe feelings of mercy would rise up and they would be more merciful to the accused. But man, there's no mercy here. But he was going to have to release one, and so he said, well, he'll be the one. I'll release him. There, you guys can think he's guilty, and I released him as part of this program. He's trying anything he can do to find a way for them to allow him to get out of doing anything here. Verse 18, and they cried out all at once, saying, away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, who for certain sedition made in the city and for murder was cast into prison. So they are willing to bring out a real murderer rather than to allow Jesus to go free. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them, but they cried, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And he said unto them the third time, why? What evil hath he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. Man, how many times has Pilate said, I find no fault in him? He even recounts how Herod found no fault in him. And they were instant with loud voices requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. Even though he knew he was innocent, even though his wife had warned him, don't have anything to do with this, he finally gave in. And let me tell you, there are, I was just listening, there's this guy who's got a lot of videos out and interviews, former CIA agent. He's doing a lot of videos, and he was in the CIA for a number of years, and there came a time where the FBI called him in for questioning, and he realized, he thought he was helping the FBI. What he realized is they were accusing him, and they started out, it was going to be like a 15-year sentence, and it's it got lower and lower, and I think it was down to 3 years in prison. And he was talking to another agent and saying, I'm innocent, I'm not going to go. And they said, you don't understand. This isn't about innocence. This is about optics. And they don't care that you're innocent. And so he took a deal and went to prison. And that's the thing. We would love to think that it's truly about justice, and the innocent is, exonerated, and the guilty are tried and found guilty, but it isn't always like that. And so you can see even here, Pilate believes he's innocent, but for the crowd, he caves in, and he sentences an innocent man to death because of a clamoring crowd. And unfortunately, that was going on in Israel. That's a big part of why Israel went into captivity back in the Old Testament, because they were doing these things. And it happens among people. It happens. And so anyway, he gave sentence. And verse 25, this is Luke 23:25. And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired, but he delivered Jesus to their will. And as they led him away, they laid hold upon one Simon, a Cyrenian, coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. Well, Jesus, he's already taken a horrible beating. He's not even recognizable as a man. And now they want him to carry, this cross. And he couldn't physically do it. He doesn't have the strength anymore. So they picked a man named Simon. But They didn't, Luke, in recording this, he didn't just say, oh, it's some Simon. He said, Simon the Cyrenian. And, that's the thing about the Word of God here. The Word here does not try to hide or obscure. It tries to give testimony that people could go seek it out and see if it's true. Understand that Luke is writing, maybe 50 to 60 years after these events when this is being written and published. And he's giving details that would allow people to go and talk to people and find out. With the details given, they could have gone and talked to people and if it weren't true, people could have said it weren't true. It wasn't true. And they could have written books and had testimony, countering the account of the Gospels. But you don't have that because it was true. And so he gives the name and who it is. It's Simon the Cyrenian. And there's a little more detail that's given. Let's look at Mark. Go to Mark's account in chapter 15. Mark 15 and verse 21. Oh, I have something wrong here, I think. Mark 15. Is it right? Oh, I jumped a chapter? What's going on? Yeah, I jumped a chapter. Okay. And let's go to verse 20. And when they had mocked him and took off the purple from him and put on his own clothes on him and led him out to crucify him, and they compel one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. He's speaking about people that people know. Saying this is Simon the Cyrenian, whose children are Rufus and Alexander. And so they could go and find these people and talk to them. And if you would, briefly, I didn't realize we're out of time, but if you go to Romans 16, Romans 16:13, Paul says, salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. Very likely historians and those who look into these believe this Rufus was the son of Simon the Cyrenian. And so his children very likely came to the Lord after this encounter. So you have Jesus walking up to Golgotha, carrying his cross, and he can't. He stumbled. And so then they pick Simon to carry the cross for him. And it's a strange thing to imagine being there and seeing this, the horror of this sight. But the people had such hatred against the Lord that they continued, and even this horrible beating wasn't enough. He had to die. Of course, we know he had to die. It was in his death that we have victory, and he was victorious in his death. The glory of the cross. That sounds contradictory, but it is a glorious thing that he went and paid that price for us.